Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this National Sorry Day webinar presented by the Healing Foundation. My name is Steve Larkin and I'm the chair of the Healing Foundation. I'm also a Kanarakan man from the Northern Territory and currently the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous at Adelaide University. And as chair, I'd like to make some brief introductory remarks. I'd like to start by explaining why Sorry Day is important. The 1997 tabling in Parliament of the Bringing Them Home inquiry in its report brought to light the extent of Australia's stolen generations history and shared this with the nation. Now, the report made a series of recommendations to address the impact of the stolen generation policies and practices on survivors and their families. Now, 28 years on, many crucial actions have not been taken. National Sorry Day is about honouring stolen generation survivors and marks the tabling of the Bringing Them Home report. It's an opportunity to acknowledge the strength and resilience of survivors, to recognise the continuing impact of Australia's stolen generations policies, and reflect on the pressing needs of survivors today. Now, about stolen generation survivors. Many survivors are elderly and are now over 50 years of age, often suffering multiple chronic health conditions without the money to afford the treatment they need. Sadly, their health and wellbeing are significantly worse than that of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of a similar age who were not removed. Survivors carry the legacy and impact of forced removal and colonisation, which has also resulted in social and economic disadvantage. Most are now eligible for aged care, yet it can be challenging to find appropriate trauma-informed care that meets their complex needs and does not trigger trauma from past institutionalisation. Many survivors still do not have access to a reparation scheme or to their family records, which is crucial not only for healing, but often required for accessing programs and other support. Urgent priorities include improved access to records, both public and private collections, culturally safe and appropriate aged care that doesn't re-traumatise people, equitable redress for survivors in all states and territories, investment in vital services on the ground, particularly for stolen generations organisations, because now is the time for full and fair redress for all survivors, for access to the records that hold the stories of people's past, and to ensure that stolen generation survivors are supported to age with dignity and respect. I'd like to just briefly refer to the Western Australian development yesterday. We very much welcomed yesterday's announcement by the Government of Western Australia to establish a redress scheme for survivors taken in Western Australia. Western Australia has now agreed it cannot wait another generation before acting to support ageing stolen generation survivors. The Healing Foundation is committed to working with stolen generation organisations and the WA Government to ensure stolen generations organisations are adequately and sustainably supported to provide wraparound services, and that the co-design and implementation of the scheme is survivor-centred and built on best practice examples in both Australia and internationally. So you can learn about the recommendations to support stolen generation survivors at thehealingfoundation.org.au. For the Healing Foundation, we're calling for priority measures that would have immediate positive impact to ageing stolen generation survivors, and these are access to redress for those who've not had access. As I've said, access to records held in public and private collections, trauma-informed aged care, and more support for the incredible organisations on the ground that support survivors. We're calling for a national healing package. The Healing Foundation is calling for a national package of urgent changes to enable remaining ageing survivors to live out their days with dignity. We want responsibility for a coordinated response. We're calling on all sides of politics, all levels of government, the police, churches, and others with responsibilities to support the stolen generation to prioritise a comprehensive and coordinated response. And there's a sense of urgency. Many survivors already passed away since key actions were first recommended. Those who are left are ageing. The urgency of acting now to support elderly survivors in their last years and decades cannot be overstated. We cannot wait another generation. We also released a report earlier this year called Are You Waiting for Us to Die? The Unfinished Business of Bringing Them Home, where disturbingly we found only 6% of the Bringing Them Home report recommendations have been clearly implemented. So today we've brought together two stolen generation survivors, Ian Ham and Auntie Yvonne Mills, and you're going to hear from them about their experiences from their time as stolen children, their experiences of trying to obtain their family records, and the work they do today to unite survivors and call for justice. So thank you. I'll now hand over to the Healing Foundation's CEO, Shannon Dodson, to guide today's conversation. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for that really great introduction to welcome us here today for this Sorry Day webinar. As Steve said, my name's Shannon Dodson. I'm a Yawuru woman. My family's from Broome in Western Australia, and like many Aboriginal families, my family has also been impacted by forced removal, and I think the Bring Them Home report found that most Aboriginal families have had some impact by the stolen generations. So it's such an important thing for us to talk about today. I also just want to acknowledge that we are doing this webinar on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, and I'm really, really glad to have Anna Yvonne and Ian here with me today. And today we're really wanting to have a conversation about Anna Yvonne and Ian's experiences, and also talking about some of the urgent needs that are still required for survivors. And as Steve said, I think it's obviously interesting day today from the news that we had yesterday with Western Australia now introducing a redress scheme, which is one of the priorities that's been called for decades. And I think that it's very warmly welcomed. And as Steve said, we're looking forward to seeing how the Healing Foundation and other organisations can work with the WA government to ensure that it is effective and provides the support to survivors as needed. We do have a few slides as well, and one of the things we just wanted to share in the first instance is hopefully will come up on the screen a map, and this is from 2018 and 2019, and this just shows you an estimate of the amount of survivors in every state and territory. And I say estimate because it's difficult to get the exact numbers, and what we know and what the ABS has said is that, you know, this is probably, the numbers are a lot larger, but this gives a bit of a snapshot of where survivors are currently based. And as you can see, there are quite large numbers in Queensland, New South Wales and WA. And so I think that's why redress in both WA and Queensland has been such a big issue, because that is where we're seeing some of the highest populations. So what I might do now is just get Anna Yvonne and Ian to introduce themselves. I might just throw to you, Anna Yvonne, if you wanted to maybe just share a little bit about yourself and your story and whatever you feel like you're comfortable to share.
Okay, thanks Shannon. My name is Yvonne Mills, and my connections to family and country are through the Gugada and Mirning people of the far west coast of South Australia. I'm a stolen generation survivor, and I, along with my 4 older siblings, were removed, well, I'll say forcibly removed from our mother in Adelaide, and held in an office in the city, in an agency's office. And we didn't see our mother again until, well, I was, at the time my eldest brother was 9 years old and I was 25 months old. While I can't recall what happened to actually articulate that, I grew up with the feelings of loss, not feeling unwanted. And at the age of 6, I was told my mother did not want me, so she gave me away. And it wasn't until the national inquiry was announced when I was much, much older that I realised this removal of children was happening all over the country and in every state and territory, and I was absolutely shocked. And the first thing that came to my mind was what I was told as a 6-year-old was basically going to be a lie. And that is why I got involved in the National Inquiry by being a part of the process of being interviewed, finding what records were held, and I was able to find my records, which was for 16 years of my life as a state ward, was 5 pages. However, my older brother and elder sister, they had about 60 pages of records of my mother constantly asking for her children to be returned to her time and time again, and that went on for several years. It's a shameful part of our story, and shameful for my mother as well. We don't understand the impact that mothers had when they had their children stolen, and the trauma, compounded by trauma over and over again, leads to, you know, stolen generation people and their descendants are experiencing the trauma that has occurred in our communities ever since colonisation, the stolen children, deaths in custody, and, you know, it just goes on and on. So there's a lot of healing that needs to happen, and thankfully I'm been on a healing journey, and yeah.
Thank you, Auntie Yvonne, and we'll come back to that records issue
yes.
as well. But Ian, I think, you know, as Auntie Yvonne was saying, finding out in the inquiry that actually this was happening to a lot of children, I'm sure that would have been devastating as well, to know that this is something that was happening across the country. And so, Ian, do you want to maybe just talk a little bit about your experience and...
Yeah, sure, Shannon. And I'm sure some people already know it because it's been around a bit, but just in brief, so I was born in 1964 and I separated from my mother when I was 3 weeks old. And I was adopted about a year later, but went to some non-Aboriginal people when I was 3 months old who adopted me, and I effectively think of them as mum and dad. But I grew up in a town where there were 2 other Aboriginal people. That was 2 other girls they adopted later on. So there was 3 Aboriginal people in a town of about 3,500 people. So you notice you're different to everybody else. The funny part of it, I grew up in Yarrawonga, which is on the Victoria-New South border. But my family, where I'm from, is Shepparton, so I'm a Yorta Yorta man. And Shepparton is right in the middle of Yorta Yorta country, and Yarrawonga's in Yorta Yorta country, but I didn't know that was my country. And I didn't know that I was from Shepparton, which is only 40 miles from Yarrawonga. I remember going over to Shep when we were kids, you know, go shopping in the big town kind of stuff, and thinking, oh, Shep's awfully flat. Found out later that's actually where I'm from. And I've said this before, did I pass my own family in the street and not know? That's something which probably when I found that out was more confronting than if I'd been from Alice Springs or the Kimberley or somewhere else, you know, Cape York or something. That was probably more confronting, knowing I was so close physically, but so far in every other thing. And I only found out that I was from Yorta Yorta country, my own country, after I left Yarrawonga and moved off to Bendigo and then on to Melbourne, and started looking for where I was from. Which in itself was an unusual experience. How do you start that? How do you start that journey? And I hadn't really thought of it about being particularly Aboriginal, but just being an adopted child. It's interesting, I was working at Aboriginal Affairs Victoria, the Office of Aboriginal Affairs as it was then, in 1989. So I was 24, I think I was, still relatively young. Had hair in those days too. Haven't always been this good looking. The phone rang and I happened to be walking past it, and I picked it up because it was at the main reception area, and I picked it up and it was a journo on the phone. And she said, she introduced herself, she said, look, I'm looking to do a story on Aboriginal children who were adopted. Do you know any? And I said, yeah, I do. I'm one. And she said, oh, could I come and interview you? Sure. And it was, when she came and spoke to me to do it, she actually set up by saying she'd been doing some research on something else, and she happened to notice the extraordinary high amount of Aboriginal children who'd seemed to be growing up in places where they weren't from, and that they could recall being in a home or being adopted and stuff. And she thought, oh, something's going on here. So she wrote a story in The Age. This was in 1989. And that was in the beginning stages of when people started to talk about something which was never spoken about, which was the removal of Aboriginal children. It just wasn't spoken about. And it started to get momentum, and then the Human Rights Commission and Commissioner Mick Dotson, your father, first Social Justice Commissioner, I've worked with him in the early 90s, and it started to get legs about there's something big here, something really big. And then there was the inquiry. And like you, Yvonne, I gave evidence to the inquiry too. And it was fortunate because I'd worked with the Human Rights Commission. I knew Sir Ron Wilson and I knew Jim Brooks and a few others who worked on it. So they sought me out to give evidence, and how the whole thing built from there. And the report itself was just I think a quantum leap in how this country understands itself. As for me, I found my family, and I was extraordinarily fortunate, because you go through that thing of will anybody want me kind of stuff. I was extraordinarily fortunate that yes, they more than wanted me. It was overwhelming actually, but you know, you navigate those things and you get through them, and you get through it, but then it just turns into a world of pretty good stuff. So I have a huge extended family, which is good. My adopted family, I'm a Ham by adoption, a James by birth. So out of the bad things, there is some fortunate things, I suppose, is how I'd put it. And so a lot of what I've done in the years since then, been involved in Stolen Generations Matters, and doing things that I hope can bring a sense of comfort and purpose to other stolen children as well.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing that. And I think it's important for people to understand that, you know, these are very real living stories that have impact still today. And I think sometimes people think that, oh, you know, this happened such a long time ago, but which is not true, because we have people who are still living and experiencing, and as you were saying, that trauma becomes layered from so many things. And I think it's also important, that point about when we're talking about stolen generations, survivors and stolen children, I think, you know, people often think it's just about the institutions, but there was also Aboriginal children that were adopted or put into the care of other family members. You know, the stories are, you know, they're not all the same.
They're multi-layered and different. A lot of the focus is on where people went, but really the focus is on where people weren't.
Yeah.
You weren't where you belonged. You weren't with your mother. You weren't on your country. You weren't in your community. You weren't in your culture. You were somewhere else. Some people were in institutions. Some, like myself, were adopted. Some were just moved all over the joint in a range of different and terrible circumstances. But the one thing we all share in common is not where we were, but where we weren't, and that was where we belonged and where we should have been.
Yeah, and I think that's leans into why records are so important, because, you know, records aren't just about, finding out information. It really is for a lot of people, and Auntie Yvonne, I'm sure you can talk to this, but it's about someone's identity. And it also is about people being able to connect with family. Records have been used in order for stolen children to find out where they come from and to be able to reunite with that family. And so I think that that's another big issue that we really need to fix as a country, is that urgent and prioritise access to records, because we still have survivors who sometimes are waiting years. And we know there are stories of people who were never united with their families because they couldn't find the information or it was withheld. And so, Auntie Yvonne, I think, as we're saying, also I think the issue with the records, and you have talked about this as well, and when you were saying, your mother wrote letters and sometimes information was redacted, or, I think also survivors accessing records now, it can be quite confronting what's in there because it's often written from, a colonial perspective as well.
Yeah.
So I guess in terms of, and what we might do is just put up on the screen if you don't mind.
Yes.
So this, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about this, and then we might have a look at your photos as well? But
just to mention what enabled the government and the agencies to remove Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families was the Aborigines Act. And the first Aborigines Act in South Australia, from where, my state of birth, was in 1911. And my mother was born 8 years after that. Was legislated. And the chief protector of the state was the legal guardian of every Aboriginal and half-caste child in the state. It wasn't the parents, and that was an abuse of their human rights. The children that were taken away, it was an abuse of their human rights. And the destruction of the Aboriginal society and the taking away of the children was an act of genocide. And we've got to remember that. It was purely to get rid of the race. And that's what was in place. The Act and the assimilation period where the exemption came from. And you'll see that my mother's exemption was signed in 1944, and by Richard Penhall, who had been a superintendent of a mission in South Australia, and moved on to be the head of the Aborigines Department, a chief protector, and also secretary of the Aborigines Protection Board. Now, my mother had already been married for 5 years when she was given this exemption. It was forced on her, and you note it's an unconditional one, so it could never be revoked. So she was caught in two worlds, absolutely. And a letter came with the, this is the letter that came with the exemption form. So she only realised that she needed an exemption because she was married to a non-Aboriginal man, and she went to apply for the maternity allowance when after she had a second child, because women were eligible for the maternity allowance then. So when she received the exemption, this enclosed letter was in it, and it was saying that she must not associate with Aborigines. The only chance she would get to go to see her family was if the Aborigines Protection Board gave permission. And she had to live like that. And I've only been able to come across these records after the Bringing Them Home report and recommendation 25 that says that, you know, people on proof of identity could get their records. So I wrote away to get my records, and my brothers and sisters wrote away to get theirs. And when mine came back, there was 5 pages. They were copies of little index cards of about this size that 16 years of my life was on those pages, and the sorts of things that I went through. But it was really important for me to be able to get the records, not only from the Welfare Department, but also from the Aborigines Department, because they held records as well. And I didn't realise that at first, but I ended up getting them. And with the pages that my brother and sisters got were all these letters from our mother, asking to see us, asking how we were, asking for our return, demanding our return to her, because she was promised. She got into the situation with her is that our father deserted her and his 5 children and moved to another state, and therefore was not, because he was living in another jurisdiction, he was, you know, free. But my mother wasn't, and that's what happened to her. She went for help, was not given help at first from a mainstream organisation because she was an Aborigine. She went to the Aborigines Department and they said, we can't help you, you're exempt. So eventually she was told she could get help, and so she had to go to Adelaide, and they said, you will get all the help that you need. If you go to Adelaide, we've made this appointment for you. And so that's what happened. Mum was taken into a meeting, and us 5 children were locked in a room. And although I was only 25 months old, I don't recall anything that happened there. And I've only been told by my brother and my sisters about what happened that day, and it was really, really traumatising. We were actually locked in the room, and I don't know for how long. It may have been all day, and from there we went to an institution for several months, depending on how long it took for us to be placed out, without our mother even knowing that was happening. It happened really quickly over a period of several months that we were placed out. But we were initially we were admitted, and then we were committed. And the only reason why I've been able to find all of this out is to have, you know, applied to get access to my records. But that also leads you to be able to find other records. And because of the mission that my mother was on, was born, was a Lutheran mission, Lutheran Archives had a lot of records on family, a lot of records on, a lot of photographs. It's endless, the amount of records that you can access to find your family. So we We had a visit, my sisters and I had a visit with our mother when I was around 6 years old, and that wouldn't have been long after I was told that my mother didn't want me, so she gave me away. And so I thought, well, you know, that was in preparation for this meeting with my mother. And up to the welfare department again, and you know, with the meeting, and I just looked at my mother the whole time. I didn't take my eyes off of her, this beautiful dark woman with this blue dress on.
And I'll just
sitting.
put up this photo of
Yeah, yeah, that's my mother. That's her when she was about 19 years old, and that photograph comes from Tyndale's expedition to Coonamble Mission on the west coast. He'd visited twice, once when she was 9 years old, and that was when she was 19. And that was soon after she came back from being away from the mission, because at 12 and a half she was sent away. Remembering that her parents weren't her legal guardian, it was the chief protector. So she was sent away at 12 and a half on a training, Aborigines training program. And it was actually working as a domestic.
Yeah.
So she was there when Tyndale came, and so it was a genealogy expedition, and there was records of my mum talking to the researchers and her parents talking to the researchers as well. So, you know, I've been able to find these things one by one. So it does give you a story about, it helps you with your finding yourself and finding the truth. But it wasn't until the redress, the South Australian redress scheme, that the truth was actually the final thing that I wanted to confirm, that what I'd been told was actually a lie, and that didn't come about until 2018. So it's been a long journey, and you know, one of a lot of truth telling.
Yeah. And I'm sure it was heartbreaking for your mum as well.
Oh, absolutely. Mum, you know, she didn't have it easy. She, you know, she suffered, and that was very hard on her and her whole family.
Yeah.
Her whole, you know, family helped her along the way and looked after her, you know, when they could. But, you know, your loss of 5 children all at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's really these layers of trauma that people don't quite understand the gravity of. And I think, Ian, we were talking the other day about, you know, how the impact of this and that trauma and what healing can potentially look like is complicated. And you were talking the other day about, you know, you've had these moments of contemplating, what if I was never taken, and who would I be, what would I be like? And, you know, maybe, do you want to just talk a bit about, you were talking a bit about your original name and just how that plays out, and it's a complex thing to...
It is. I mean, it's something, you're right, Shannon, what we were talking about was, there's often this thing in your mind about where I might have been and who I might be, because you start off as one person, right? So I was born Andrew James, and very early on I became another person, Ian Ham. And I often think I went from being one person to two, one who existed, one who might have existed, and one who does exist. And that goes to, what if I'd never been separated? What if I'd never been removed? What would Andrew James be like at the age of 60? What would he have done? What wouldn't he have done? who would I be? And that's always something that's in your mind. I'm sure Yvonne thinks the same too. What if her mother had not gone from Port Lincoln to Adelaide with those insurances she was going to get help, and in fact something else happened?
Mm-hmm.
How different would your life have been? I mean, not just a little bit of difference. This is a fundamental shift in the direction of your life. It's not just a little deviation. It's a huge. It completely changes who you are, your destiny, and everything about you. So I often think about that, and I think about the things that I've lived through as Ian Ham, and what that's made me, the good things and bad things as well. And I look at my family, who I was from, and think about, what if I'd grown up in this family? Who would Andrew James be? It goes back to, I think, your point before, Shannon, about there are people who say, it was such a long time ago, what's the problem? Because it's with you for your entire life. It is your life, and will not stop being your life. And there's never a point where you grow out of it. As I often say, you never get over it, you just get used to it, because that's who you are. You just get used to this in your life every day. I was in a meeting yesterday with some Canadians, and it was about, economic advancement. But one of them put up a slide about residential schools. And that was when I got your message. He put up that slide and he said, I might be chair of the First Nations Management and Finance Authority in Canada, but I'm one of the residential school survivors. And he said, I just put this up just to give you a little background on me. My phone went off and it was the message you sent me about the Western Australian government. And I just thought, my God, the timing.
Yeah.
You know. But he was explaining, why does he do what he does now? Because of what happened to him when he was a child, being in a residential school. It makes who you are. It never leaves you. I think the important thing for me is the trauma, the things that shape you that haven't been great or good in your life. I know for me as myself, I've always concentrated on making sure I don't pass that on to my children. That's extraordinarily hard. Yeah. And even in the best of circumstances. So, and even my kids are not immune to it. And so the idea of intergenerational trauma passing on, that's huge. And this is where I think it never changed everything, but records are so important because they at least give you context. They at least give you a background narrative to who you are and why you are the way you are. That's often you think about, why am I like this? If you've got records that tell you factually what happened, where and when and who and why. As Yvonne's records showed, that terrible exemption certificate, the wording of it has ceased to be an Aborigine. To have to pick between that as a person and that's not passed on, I mean, that's terrible. So records at least give you the context, they at least explain what was happening. Doesn't change its impact, but at least you have that bigger picture, which is incredibly important for people. Yeah.
And I will just remind people that if you do want to ask a question, we will get to questions in a little bit. So feel free to chuck a question into, there should be somewhere on live there that you can put a question in. But I think this probably, there are a lot of complex things to deal with for survivors. It's not a straightforward answer. We know that there are, though, you know, some of these quite urgent needs, which is why the WA redress announcement yesterday was very important, because unfortunately there's survivors who have already passed. You know, my own auntie has passed away in WA, and she has not seen this become a reality. We know that there's many others. So there are some really urgent things, and you know, the records issue in terms of that access, also when we're thinking about survivors ageing and what that support looks like for them as they're ageing. and also the services and the organisations that need that sustainable support to be able to support survivors as well. But I might just touch on the redress issue a little bit, obviously because it was a big thing yesterday, in that talking about all of this and the impact, at the end of the day, we know no amount of money is ever going to compensate people for what they went through. But what the Bring Them Home report found is that redress is an important part of validating people's experience, and also providing some kind of rectification for what they've been through. It's a common thing internationally. You know, we have a national redress scheme for survivors of sexual abuse. It's something that is about acknowledging people's experience and what they've been through. And I think WA announcing yesterday was a really great step. We obviously still have Queensland, unfortunately, and hopefully we might see some action there. I think that also there is the issue of needing to revisit some of the previous schemes that were open, as there's some people who missed out, and I think that that's an ongoing conversation. And Auntie Yvonne, you touched on that redress process a little bit, but do you want to maybe talk a little bit, I guess, like why that process was important for you, or just, you know, in terms of redress more generally, why it's important?
Yeah, for me, the redress, South Australian redress scheme that I applied for was about actually finding out the truth. I'd obviously had all of this information and knew what it was leading to. I mean, reading the records was, I mean, you could see in the records that something wasn't right, and that it was, you know, a forcible removal. But I needed that to be confirmed by, to be officially confirmed, and that's why I went in. It was never about the money, but I know that there are people out there that, in South Australia in particular, that also went to this for the redress, that you know, can't afford to have the health care that they need. And you know, the reason why that we're living with this trauma at the ages that we are is because we didn't get looked after in the first place. So we should have received you know, the appropriate medical care right at the beginning. But, you know, it was, you know, just checking, going and have a checkup for your dental every year, making sure about that. But it wasn't about you physically. And that is why, you know, the trauma is still within us, and it won't go away.
And it impacts on your body as well, like trauma.
Yes, so, you know, I'm 25 months old, Ian is 3 months old. The myth around babies not knowing or understanding what happens to them has been scientifically proven incorrect. Anything that happens in a family affects the babies and the infants. And the first 1,000 days of life for a person, for an individual, sets their development and their future health. So I've had my own health conditions over the years. My sisters certainly have, and my brother certainly did. And you know, those, the Victorian Health Channel has a whole section that you can go into to locate trauma in babies and infants, and it tells you there exactly what it does, what you need to look at, and where you can go for help. And this is only in probably the last 10 years. Yeah.
And I think that's right with the redress, is that for a lot of survivors, it can, even though it's not necessarily about the money, it's helpful for a lot of survivors who don't have a lot of money and have used it for, we've heard, for them to go back to country, to be with family, a lot of different things, which is really helpful. And Ian, I know you were very heavily involved in sort of the creation of the Victorian scheme, which is currently open. So there's two schemes that are currently open at the moment for Victoria and the territories. We do encourage people to find out information about that if they think they might be eligible. But Ian, do you want to maybe touch on a bit about the importance of the scheme and I guess your experience with why it is so important?
Yeah, well, I mean, redress as a whole, I mean, it's a compensation scheme. I think for me there's two main parts to why these schemes need to exist and be substantive. That's the other part. There's no point them existing if they're not substantive. So the two reasons: one, in the society we live in the world we live in, a measure of regret, of sorrow, of accepting responsibility, like it or lump it, is measured in dollar terms. I mean, that's just a fact. And so these schemes need to reflect the genuineness of the regret and the sorrow for what happened to us as stolen children. So that's why Victoria's set at $100,000 a person, that Western Australia's $85,000 a person, the Commonwealth, when you add it up, $83,000 a person. They're a measure of accepting responsibility for what we as a state have done to our people. So that's important. The other important part of it is we're all getting older. I mean, I'm at the younger end of those in Victoria, and I'm 60. There are people plenty older than me who have, in a lot of instances, had pretty rugged lives, have had lives that they haven't fared well, or the trauma, as you spoke about before, has walked with them every day and prevented them from being what they might otherwise have been. At least, and it's a terrible way of putting it, but at least in the back half of the back part of their life, with this money, they can have a measure of comfort, they can have a measure of not feeling financial pressure that they haven't had their whole life. We can do that. And that's a positive thing. The thing that also goes with it in the Victorian scheme is you also get, and the feedback on this has been really important, where a lot of people said the money is important, but there's something else that's more important. They get an apology, a written apology, signed by the Premier. So not an auto-sign thing. Dan Andrews, the former Premier, and Jacinta Allen, the current Premier, insist on hand-signing all those letters. Insist on doing it themselves. That's really important. And Jacinta Allen has started doing personal group apologies. They're not publicised. They're not in the media. Just discreet invitations go out to Stolen Generations people that the Premier would like to hold an event in X location, and she does. Yeah. And they meet with the Premier. That's where redress, the schemes are particularly and really important to individuals to acknowledge, to feel that they've been heard, that their life wasn't in vain, and at last they're being, for want of a better term, believed that their experience was real. That's incredibly important about these schemes. Yeah. And I do think New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania, those governments should look at the Victorian scheme and Western Australia and the Commonwealth and revisit their schemes to say, if that's the benchmark, we may have been first, but perhaps we need to go back and revisit to get to those benchmarks. And I think Queensland needs to needs to accept that it cannot just ignore its stolen generation community, which was the point of the title of the report that we launched on Apology Day. Is the Queensland Government's solution just waiting until all those stolen children in Queensland die and then it's not a problem anymore? Is that what the Queensland Government is saying? Because to the casual observer, and I'm not one way or the other of it, but there doesn't seem to be any reasonable reason, which is terrible English, but reasonable reason as to why you wouldn't establish a redress scheme built off the experiences of all the other jurisdictions so that you can set a new benchmark or at least get equal to.
Yeah, and I think that is so powerful, that idea of being believed. And I think that is such a big part of these processes. It is that acknowledgement and validation of someone's experience. And particularly, as you were saying, Anna Yvonne, like, there are a lot of children who were told that their parents didn't want them, or at times told that their parents had died, which was not true. They find out later in life they actually reunite, or sometimes don't, because that parent
has passed away.
In the
intervening years,
and that is just devastating. And so I think that, you know, having that acknowledgement is so important. I'm going to chuck to questions in a minute, but I was thinking, Anna Yvonne, there was a really lovely photo here that you had.
Oh, yes.
And it would, if you're happy to, maybe just talk, we talked about this a little bit before, but this is just a beautiful photo of you and your siblings.
Yes, so when I was 16, I got an invitation via welfare to my foster parents' home, and it was to the wedding of my sister there in the middle. And there was no redactions on the invitation, and I hadn't seen my sister since 6 years. I was 6 years old on that first visit that I mentioned previously, and I hadn't seen my brother for 6 years because I was about 10, and he was living in the same country town, working on a farm, and had to walk past the home of my foster parents into the city. And one day he came to see me, and I hadn't seen him then. I don't know how he knew where to come to my foster parents' home, but he arranged to pick me up and take me to the wedding, which was about two hours north from the home that I lived in Adelaide, north of Adelaide. So there we all are together for the first time, and I was just saying to Shannon previously about what I felt that day. When I just stood back and looked at them all, and I saw a bit of myself in each of them. The way they laughed, and it was immediate, you know, that connection was immediate. I knew I belonged there because I felt. Not that my foster family, you know, didn't look after me and care for me and all of that. That was me. That was who I was, and that was a wonderful day. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful photo, and if people didn't guess, Anna Yvonne is the one in the white jacket with the flower on her lapel. She looked beautiful.
Yeah, I was still a ward of the state then, so I still had to abide by, and my sister next to my brother, she was 17, so we still had to abide by the rules and regulations of a state ward. Yeah.
Thank you. So what we might do is throw over to some questions. And thank you to everybody who's joined us as well. I think this has just been a really important conversation, and honestly, I could probably keep talking to you both for hours, which...
Yes.
But I think one of the questions that has just come through is, I guess, why does the redress scheme sometimes take up to 12 months or longer to actually be paid out? And this is basically talking about, then going through the records and, just the complexity of the process and how it can take quite a long time. And I think what this person's posed is that exactly what I think is difficult for some survivors, where they're saying that why would people put themselves through this trauma?
Yep.
And I think that is an issue because there are some survivors who come in and out of the process. But I think that the schemes are trying to be as flexible and as
So
responsive.
I led the development of the Victorian scheme. So there is no simple way forward with this. It takes time. The amount of applications that we received in the Victorian scheme, and it would have been the same for other schemes too, it's just a huge volume. And then you have to establish, and you have to have a process of how you evaluate each application. Even if you have generous standards, and it's not always based on records. After a while, you look for what you know to be real, and there's also precedent stuff. If something happens enough, it mightn't be in official records, but clearly there is a pattern. For example, we noticed in Victorian applications, there are parts of the state where the same names of people who were involved in the separation of children keep coming up in people's stories. And it doesn't take long to build quite literally a picture of what was going on in that part of the state with those particular people and that particular organisation heavily involved in the removal of children. And it comes up time and again. So you accept that without there being official records. It creates a record of itself, but it takes time to work through. In terms of trying to get through as quickly as possible, we try to do that, but finding the people who can work that through. Because in Victoria, we have a separate panel of community people who assess applications, make the decision of yes or no. The bureaucracy does all the research, does all the backgrounding. So that's one thing we decided to do, was don't make the applicant have to try and find their records, because it's really difficult. So the state accepts that, but going through government agencies and so forth, it takes a while to do that research. So there's no escaping that, but you try and do it as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. We built a thing into the scheme that if a person has lodged their application, if they pass away before we assess it, we still process it. And if there is an estate, we make the payment to their estate. Because the person had indicated the intent of seeking the redress scheme, but they passed away in the intervening time. So you try and build it as generously as possible. You try and do it as quickly as possible. But there's the practical realities of a lot of applications and research and so forth.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, unfortunately, this is the difficulty with any of these things, is we've already lost so much time and it's hard. And schemes, I know current schemes do try to be as flexible as possible and try and push things through. But as you said, sometimes the volume of applications means that
we try and keep the imperfection as low as possible, but there will always be imperfection.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's also a question here which I think is really important, and I think it's something that particularly a lot of the younger generations experience, is if you have, older family members who are obviously, suffering from their own trauma, they sometimes don't want to share their experience or to talk about that because it's too hard. And, they may not want other family members to try and access records because it's something that's so difficult for them. So I guess, what does that mean for younger generations in terms of accessing information as part of their own identity and healing? And I guess it's, it is that complex thing about what happens when you obviously, this person's saying, it's important to respect your elders.
Yes.
But,
where did I come from?
Yeah.
What's our backstory? Yeah.
And I think it is also that issue of, we don't want these stories to be lost.
I think with this stuff, Shannon, if I might answer this, is that this goes to where those who are the holders of records so government agencies and so forth, it's easy for them to fall back on the current state of affairs and say, well, the law says X, Y, and Z, and records can only be accessed under DUMA. It's easy to do that, but it's also, in my view, a way of ducking a deeper responsibility. If you really want to do something about this, you will find a way forward for this to happen. You will find a way as government agencies, as government, to be able to do this and get it done so that younger generations can access information, but also accommodate and respect the way that the older people who it's about feel that they're not compromised either. I don't know what that is, but until we put our minds to it, we won't know. And that's probably the real challenge for this is, in the way of accessing records, we really need to put work to it and not just say, oh, you know, computer says no, as they say.
Yeah.
There's 1,000 reasons why you can't, but there's only one reason why you can, and that's because you should.
Yeah.
Your granddaughter is giving big kicks in the belly at the moment, listening to listening to their granny speak and hearing your stories, and that makes me feel a bit teary. But do you have any advice for your granddaughter?
Lots of love, love, love. You know, come hug me, Mum. Come hug me, and that's a big part of it is love for one another. You know, hugs, always hug. Because he as a child he was like that.
Yeah.
You know, he always wanted hugs. Yeah. So lots of love, lots of cuddles.
I'm sure you're going to love being a grandmother.
Yes,
What's your name going to be? Have you decided? Nan or Gran or?
Well, it's kind of a bit different because in Torres Strait Islander, in language, in the grandfather's language, is mine. I am Akka.
Akka.
Yes. In our own language at home, it would be Granny.
Yeah.
It'll be Granny.
Yeah.
So
you might have two names.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. That's lovely. So I think we also have a bit of questions around, I guess, supporters and allies and what, you know, I think it's so important for, as we know after the referendum voice, I think that a lot of us blackfellas we're tired, and you know we will keep fighting because that's what we do, and we will never stop having these conversations. But we really do need support of more than just our own communities to talk about these things and to talk with your families and to getting people to understand. What would you say to allies in terms of some of the things that they could do? And someone's also posed a question about, in terms of redress in Queensland, for instance, what's something that they could do?
Okay. So I'll answer them as separate questions. So the first one, allies, friends. A different way of thinking about this is why is Sorry Day? Why do we revisit it every year and remind ourselves of this? There's a bigger thing going on in the world at the moment where history is starting to repeat itself. And if you forget what happened in the past, you're condemned to repeat it again. And that's often the same mistakes. The reason why we should always revisit the 26th of May, because it reminds us of what happened when we stole children, when we took children away from where they belong, their family, their community, their culture and their country. I think it's impingent on all of us to remind ourselves of that terrible, terrible thing, to ensure that we don't do it again. Because if we forget, then we're condemned to do it again. So that's for people who are allies, for people who aren't allies, for people who quite frankly don't care. we should still remind ourselves on the 26th of May every day, this is the consequence of what happens if you steal children, and we should never forget that. So that's why all our friends, all our not friends, whoever they are, that's why we should revisit this every day. In terms of the Queensland Government, well, they're the only one left in the country, I think. Agitate, hassle, hustle, badger, what else did I say? Bludgeon. I may have spoken about this before, but it's now the focus is very much on the Queensland Government, and we should not allow the spotlight to diminish on them in addressing redress in Queensland. They should not be able to fob it off. Not only should they be held to account, they should hold themselves to account. Is this who we are as a government? Is this who we are of a group of people who hold the Treasury benches in the Queensland Parliament? Are we so hard-hearted that we will not address something that previous governments should have, but we have the opportunity to do now, in fact have the obligation to do, and also are the only holdouts? And what does that say about us to the rest of the country? All those questions should be drawn to, the lights put on the Queensland Government.
Yeah. What about you, Yvonne, if you think about how people can support survivors and what?
Yes, I think accessing the records, I think it's something that if I hadn't pushed myself to actually go and, seek out all of the information that I've been able to find across a whole range of areas, but most importantly, the welfare and Aboriginal affairs records. But the people themselves have to do that. I can't imagine that anyone would any other person would get access to that information. It has to be the individual themselves. But, there's Aboriginal affairs, places everywhere. So, government records, Queensland government records, there'll be heaps of information in those records, just like there was in South Australia government archives, government archives.
And that's where, like you're both saying, is that Attorney Generals, for instance, have a say over a lot of the archives in states and territories. So write to your local Attorney General or your Minister or your Premier and ask these questions and talk. And I think, the more that we can get people talking about it and agitating, then, that's where I think you can start to see some movement. I know we've run over time, but I think we can still probably do a couple of questions. There is one here which I think is someone who's actually talking about their experience and saying that they were forcibly removed in 1973 at 12 months old. Myself and my 6 siblings all taken at once. My mother had all her children sent over the state of New South Wales. We have tried to apply for the redress scheme through Aboriginal Affairs, and we have all been told we are not entitled to any reparations. My mother, can someone please scroll up so I can see the rest of the question? My mother is 80 years old this year, and to this day she hadn't received anything. What can she do to seek some justice that happened to her and her children?
Yeah. So that one, I think, is really a question for the New South Wales scheme or the New South Wales government to respond to. I do know that they had a cut-off date of, I think it was 1969, when the Aborigines Protection Act was repealed in New South Wales. That doesn't mean Aboriginal children weren't removed post that act, and I think that's when I said New South should probably revisit its scheme. I think that's one of those issues that need revisiting. Again, it would be hassling the New South Wales government to do that, to revisit the scheme. Probably more directly if contacting Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales to find out, is there any other way of accessing the scheme if it's still open, short of them revisiting it and redesigning it.
And I think that this is
short.
what we are trying to advocate for,
Yes.
because sadly you're not alone. There are other people in New South Wales and South Australia as well who at the time were either not eligible or, and sometimes that could be just from timeframes or.
Yep.
And I think what we've learnt now with schemes currently, so with the territories and the Victorian scheme, is even if, say, a policy, cut off at a certain date, it does not change the sentiment or the approach by a government, at that day. And so there's got to be some flexibility around those timeframes. And I think that's why the Healing Foundation, we will continue to have those conversations with the New South Wales government and South Australian government, but I would encourage others to write to those governments, particularly if you have your own personal experience. I think it is something that we can all sort of work together on how we ensure that people who potentially missed out can have some of those conversations.
I think how these schemes work are a reflection of who we are as the Australian people, to be honest. Are we tight-fisted and mean and limit them to the minimum, or are we a generous people who accept responsibility for the broader history, good and bad, of our country? That's a measure of how you can look at these schemes.
Yeah.
What do they tell us about ourselves as a nation and as a people?
Yeah. We've got a few other questions, and I'm sure we could probably do a few more. So one of the things that someone's saying, which kind of leans into what people can do, because I think people, they want to take action, they want to know how they can help. That is there an avenue for volunteer workers to assist with processing requests or other ways to assist? I think that's an important thing, is thinking about whether there is opportunities for people to be able to volunteer. I think also thinking about there are stolen generation organisations in every state and territory that process redress applications but also provide services. I'd encourage you to look those up, because a lot of them accept donations, and it would be worthwhile potentially reaching out to see if there is a way that you can help locally in your area around. I know that a lot of those organisations are really under-resourced and understaffed, so I think it is important for people to think about how they can potentially support.
These on the website?
So you can also find on the Healing Foundation website some of the stolen generation organisations that you can reach out to, and also more information about how you can also support and take action.
So reaching out to those local organisations, because they, as you say, there's a range of things people could do. And as you say, volunteer workers are always good workers. So call them up, look them up I won't say in the phone book, because when we talk about younger people, they'll go, a what? Anyway, Google it.
Google it. So I think we're going to probably wrap up soon. Just a reminder that this webinar will be available online. So we will post it later for those who were not able to watch at the time. But before we wrap up, I guess it'd be good to just get any final thoughts from the two of you. I really appreciate this conversation. As I said, I could probably talk to you all day. And I just think it's so important for us to continue to have these conversations, particularly in a way that is accessible to the public, to be able to hear firsthand, the reality of this. And I think a lot of people don't understand the human side often, and be able to hear exactly, the impact that this has had. But Annie, Yvonne, do you have any sort of final thoughts, or I guess if there was anything else that you could say, is there anything on your mind?
I think I've said everything I wanted to say, but I mean, it's good to have had this webinar, to be able to hear, my experience, Ian's experience, to learn about the Healing Foundation, which a lot of people out there probably don't know exists. So, you know, that was really important to have this, and thanks for organising it, Shannon.
Thanks for being with us. Yeah, it was good, and just acknowledging that both Arnie, Yvonne and Ian have come to Canberra from their homes in Victoria and Queensland, and I think it was just really important to get us here together to have this conversation. And thank you to you two for always being so generous in what you share, and I think that, you know, that's also another thing that people need to understand is a lot of survivors, you know, spend a lot of energy and time trying to explain their experiences and to share these, and it's such a powerful and generous thing. And so thank you for being willing to, you know, open up and be here with us. I really appreciate it.
And thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, always a
To us.
pleasure, and it's an important thing to do. So happy to
And
do it.
Ian, do you have any final thoughts?
Oh, no. I think other than, as I said before, we need to remind ourselves of this so we never do it again. That's the important thing. Other than that, it's been great being on, and thanks for asking me to do it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody out there as well. We really appreciate you joining us. And please do share this webinar far and wide when it is made available. So thanks again, and I'm sure we will have more of these conversations into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.